In today's module, we're going to be looking at cybersecurity buzzwords, and there are loads of them, right? And really the key element here is knowing when to use what words, right? And really when is the most effective time that you want to use the buzzwords, right? So think about your audience. Who's the audience here? So one of the most impressive ways of using buzzwords and knowing what they mean is during interviews, right? But if you also think about it, right, buzzwords, are no more than vocabularies, right? You're extending your palette of words that you can use in the narratives of cybersecurity situations, right? So let's look at some of these buzzwords here, right? So if we look at the kind of like the first set of buzzwords, there, that's identified in the orange boxes here. These are what we call the kind of like the offensive, the kind of like the hacking world, the pen testing, those kind of buzzwords, right? So look at the blast radius. If something was impacted, how far does it trickle down within the organization, within the systems, right? How far deep is it going, both horizontally, both vertically, and that's what the blast radius actually means. And obviously threat and threat vectors, there is a separate video that I've actually covered this, right? The attack surface, what is that area that's vulnerable? Again, there's a video that I have, right? Guest escape, if we think about hypervisors, leaking, going from one virtual machine, coming out of that, that's what I mean by guest escape here. Moat and castle, again, that's a way of defending the environment, a legacy way, but it's good to know that. DOS, denial of service, and distributed denial of service, again, that is to do with the actual offensive, defensive kind of security aspects of it. And again, use those terminologies, right? And then finally, just to wrap up this kind of like category, right? We obviously have vulnerabilities, exploitation, risks. Again, I have some YouTube videos that describes these, right? Now, the next stuff is around access, right? So if you look at it, least privilege, giving the users only the needed permissions to do their work. You don't want them giving them too much, right? And that's what least privilege means. Identity access management, that's a terminology that we use about users, giving permission to the users, authorization, authentication, and all that kind of good stuff, right? And lately, this has become more important as we move our footprint into the cloud environment, right? And really, kind of like an evolution of the IAM is kind of like role-based access, right? And that's what RBAC stands for, right? Giving permission that mirrors the kind of the roles that people are doing, right? Another category of buzzwords is around infrastructure, right? Around the actual traffic. So east-west traffic is usually traffic that's moving within the environment horizontally, right? So that's what we mean. North-south means traffic that is coming in and out of the environment, right? Typically going through a firewall out to the internet and coming back down again, that kind of traffic there. Segmentation, compartmentalize the whole network, make them more miniature in terms of the network architecture. Defense in depth means don't rely on one specific security, layer it. For example, you can have like a firewall, right? But don't stop at the firewall. Add in another layer, add in an API gateway, add in an IDS, IPS, right? So layer that security in, right? And really defense in depth and kind of like layered security kind of go hand in hand, right? Multiple components, layer that security. So if something was exposed or something that was exploited, you have something as a backup, right? Next set of buzzword is shadow IT. Shadow IT is really departments and groups within the organization doing their own thing. And you don't want that, right? You want them to adhere to the company policy. If you say everybody has to use Microsoft Office, you don't want someone using Google Sheets or Google Suite or something like that, right? Keep it consistent, right? The next set of buzzwords that we have kind of like leans towards the cloud aspects, and some of these things came about as a use of an adoption of cloud. I'll do a separate buzzword just on cloud alone because the palette of words there is quite extensive. But portability, interoperability, I did an exact video that compares these two words together. With cloud, you have scalability, the ability to grow, right? Resiliency means, how can it adapt? Resiliency means if something is to go wrong, how long will it take before something actually breaks itself, right? So I usually find from an architecture perspective, really, scalability, resiliency kind of goes hand in hand. Shared responsibility was a model that was introduced by the cloud vendors, where there's a clear demarcation between the responsibilities of the customer using the cloud platform, right, and the vendor that actually has built the cloud vendor, right? So it kind of like it's a mutual relationship there. Immutability, this is an important thing in the cloud, something that, when you do something, you cannot change it, right? And that kind of goes hand in hand with data and data privacy. Again, I'll create another buzzword just around data in itself, because that can be quite extensive, right? Due care, due diligence, again, there's a YouTube video explicitly for that. And then the next category is, like architecture, designs, right? So design for identity. So what I mean by that is when you're designing infrastructures, you're designing an environment, right? Think of identity, right? Kind of going back to that red box on the left-hand side, identity access management. Make that the center theme, right? Design patterns, right? So this is, again, a buzzword whereby, when you're trying to design something, look at from the vendors, right? For example, AWS, Google Cloud, Azure, Microsoft Azure, right? Look at some of the design patterns, that create your own design patterns. Within your organization, have a collection of design patterns that you can actually use over and over again, to which you can make small tweaks here and there. And again, an extension to design patterns is reference architectures, right? Reference architecture is something where you go with there's a recommended architecture for a specific vertical market. Let's say, for example, you're in healthcare and you're doing something in cloud and you're doing something around machine learning, right? There's probably going to be a reference architecture that's been built as a best practice, right? That you can leverage to deploy your own architecture with some deviation. So that's what reference architectures are, right? The next category is purely under a single domain of zero trust, right? So we have zero trust access, and zero trust network access. Three distinct wordings, but under the same umbrella. That is the buzzword of today. And I'll be creating an exclusive video, upcoming video, that actually describes those three categories, right? Then the next bit is to do with more along the software, shift left security. That means move more towards the software developers, right? Make sure, get integrated and embedded within the software development team, right? Be influential, CI/CD, right? That's another key word there. Continuous integration and continuous development, right? DevSecOps, right? That kind of all leans to that shift left. Where shifting left, the opposite to shift left would be shift right, which is DevSecOps, where we're actually mixing the actual development with the operations aspects of it, right? Decoupling security, right? Security can be complicated. Decouple it, make it more modularized, right? Policy as a code, right? So that's kind of like creating, an infrastructure and everything, and you're putting policies around that code. ATO, this kind of goes back to the a standard, the FedRAMP standard, which is kind of like authorization to operate. That kind of gives the permission to go ahead to someone that they can start using a service, an application, a software, a solution. Call it what you want, right? Security champions, that is about creating programs, right? Educating people, right? Educating the software world, right? Things like that. Again, security champion programs, very important buzzword. And then finally, I'm going to finish off with the good old school security wording of cryptography. And this is really a broad term. And again, I'm kind of like thinking, should we create a buzzword just around cryptography, because there's a lot, but cryptography is another important buzzword there. Thank you. And that concludes today's session.